The amount of pruning and the amount and type of pruning that's going to be done is going to be largely determined by the plants that are picked. So if you're not a person that likes to do a lot of pruning or frequent pruning, then it's a good idea to pick the plants that don't take much pruning. So the plants that stay small and keep a nice, neat form on their own. When you plant new trees, I think it's a great opportunity to look at the tree and to prune it at that point of planting. That can save you a lot of issues later. You should be pruning out any dead branches, any crossing branches, and also looking for a central leader if it's a large shade tree, so that you're not having structural issues later. You can do usually a couple of very small cuts with a hand pruner that might take you a few seconds or maybe a minute, as opposed to something later. If you let that go, if you're pruning that in 6 or 7 years, you may be doing major cuts that are a lot harder on the tree. Basically in landscape there's two types of grasses. There's your turf type or meadow type grasses, and those are more mowed down, and then more typically in these kind of instances you're looking at ornamental grasses, which are individual plants. It's best to prune those in the spring, not in the fall. If you leave the foliage there through the winter, it gives you winter interest, usually some nice colors and textures. It also acts as an insulation through the winter, which keeps you from having cold damage from cold snaps through the winter. Once you cut those back, they'll grow quickly and fill back in. If you have shrubs that bloom in the spring, it's best to wait till after they've bloomed, or else you'll lose your blooming for that season. Other shrubs would be basically pruned as needed. Hopefully you've picked things that don't take too much pruning, that are going to stay within their maximum size, will stay within the space that you want to plant them in. That's an important part of getting the right plant in the right place. If you have plants that are outgrowing their space, you're going to have to prune them more often. So the right plant in the right space isn't going to need to be pruned very often. Well, what is a weed can be a subjective situation and may vary a lot from one situation to another. If your plant will provide habitat or food for pollinators or other beneficials, then that it may be something you want to think about keeping. If it's going to be super invasive and take over and get and overrun the plants that you want to have there, then it's probably something you want to get rid of. And there are three types of weeds. There's annual weeds, there's biennial weeds, and there's perennial weeds. The annual weeds have basically their entire life cycle of germination, growing, flowering, and seeding all within 1 year. Those should be removed as soon as you can, especially before they go to seed, so that you're not creating a new seed bank for new annual weeds. Biennials are very similar, except they have a 2-year life cycle where they grow foliage the first year, and then the second year they flower and go to seed. So you have a little bit more time to get those, so it's not quite as crucial. You get them necessarily the first year, but they may be taking away from existing plants, taking water and resources away from existing plants. So probably better get rid of them as soon as you can. The most difficult group are the perennial weeds. The perennial weeds have a multi-year life cycle. Their root system will survive through the winter and not die back. Even if the top does, some will stay evergreen. Some will die back in the winter, but come back again in the spring. Those are your most difficult to deal with. The others can be often prevented just by having a good mulch. But these, you have to be more persistent. You may have to either use a post-emergent herbicide or do constant pulling on them to keep them under bay. Two of the best sources that I would look for if you're looking for more information on weeds, Weeds of the West is both a book and there's a website there for that. It's basically put out by a bunch of extension agents all over the West on some of the most common weeds around the West. The other one is 505 Outside, again, who also has the watering guidelines, is a good resource especially for weeds in this area.